Hello, everybody. My name is Banafshe, and I'm a postdoctor in sociology at University of Trondheim, NTNU, and I am the moderator of the event today, as well as one of the presenters, but Kristina Arketi is going to present on behalf of us too. This event grows out of the findings of a research project that investigated the representation of immigrants by Norwegian media during the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects that this coverage had on the life of the immigrants themselves. We are going to tell you more in a moment about our results, but in a nutshell, the media coverage consistently and over time was characterized by racism. This racism in the media also had and still has devastating effects on all domains of life of those who were exposed to it. In this study, we also realized that we were only scratching the surface of a much broader and hidden phenomenon. We were only dealing with the tip of an iceberg. Today, we are doing some more uncovering, exposing a little more of the hidden mechanisms of racism in Norway. You might ask, if this phenomenon is so broad, why are we not seeing it? Where is it? Some question that racism even exists in Norway. It is invisible because we are, so to speak, living in it, breathing in it. The mechanisms of discrimination are woven into the normality of our everyday life. In the very way we think, in how we make sense of the world around us, and how we look at the other. Racism is never only individual, but rooted in the very way we produce knowledge, in how we tell our stories and histories, and even in our education. In this sense, racism is invisible in plain sight. Another reason why racism remains hidden is that most think that it exists in the form of ugly, isolated accidents of obvious discrimination caused by some racist, narrow-minded people. Today, we want to connect some dots and show that these accidents are not only interconnected instances, but also that they are only the most visible manifestations of a society-wide phenomenon, and that you do not need to intentionally want to be racist to still perpetuate racism and be a racist. Exposing racism means becoming able to recognize its many manifestations. Racism is often entangled with colonialism, imperialism, and state violence. The gross human rights violations, ethnic cleansing, and genocide we are currently witnessing in Palestine are also the result of racism. The systematic demonization and dehumanization of an entire people. What we are witnessing is monstrous in its scope and inhumanity. But the process that has led to this has been at points very subtle. In using over time, over and over again, certain dismissive words, certain assumptions, in between the lines about moral or cultural or religious superiority to the other. A 2003 study of Israeli textbooks by the Hebrew University in Jerusalem showed Arabs mostly portrayed with a camel in an Alibaba dress. They describe Arabs as vile and deviant and criminal, people who don't pay taxes, people who live off the state, people who don't want to develop. The only representation is as refugees, primitive farmers, and terrorists. You never see a Palestinian child, or doctor, or teacher, or engineer, or modern farmer, the study said. Representations are not harmless. Over time, they have consequences. What we are witnessing in Gaza encourages us to ask what kind of actions can these representations support? But let's return to Norway. To help us with the unmasking task and connecting the dots, we have gathered a team of experts from a range of different fields and walks of life. They will relate to racism and its mechanisms in Norway, each from their perspective. Michelle Tistel is today with us, holds a doctorate in social anthropology from Harvard University. Michelle's research interests include cultural policy, heritage production, and discourses of belonging in Norway and Cuba. She has worked as a research librarian at the National Library of Norway since 2008. Jørn Skillingstad is a historian and associate professor at the University of Oslo Museum for University of Science and History. He is specialized in the history of science and the history of academic institutions in the period 1870 to 2000. His last book is Rase, Vitenskap historie, Race, a History of Science in English. Kristin Eriksen is an associate professor in educational studies at the University of Southeastern Norway. Her research and teaching revolve around racism and anti-racist education, indigenous and Sami knowledges in education, and decolonial approaches to research and pedagogy. Pati Alnes Katiavivi is a doctor employed at the maternity ward Ullevål, Oslo University Hospital. Born, raised, and educated in London, Pati is 50 years old, married with 2 children. Pati stands 177 centimeters tall. Kristina Arketi is professor in political communication and journalism at the University of Oslo. She has been studying the role of media and communication in political processes for over 20 years. She is particularly interested in the blind spots of journalism, especially in why and how the voices of minorities get muzzled and silenced. We are going to start with short individual presentations of about 8 minutes each, one after the other, and then we are then opening the floor for debate, so keep your questions for later, please. Thanks. They need to introduce myself. Yeah, so as I said, my name is Banafshe Ranji. I'm a postdoctor in sociology at NTNU University of Trondheim. I've been doing working in the research project with Kristina on media representation of immigrants during the COVID-19 pandemic. I also do research, other research such as institutional ethnography on how different practices, institutional practices, influences everyday life practices of migrants, in particular refugees. Thank you. Yes, Kristina.
Yes, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to present the study that I conducted with Banafshe also on her behalf. What I'm going to talk about is the role of the media in the construction of the standards of normality and in the reproduction of these standards, including their racist bias. So I'm going to present this study we've been working on for nearly 3 years, I think now. It's a study that has been supported by Media Tilsynet, and it's about the way immigrants were portrayed by Norwegian mainstream media during the COVID pandemic. We also wanted to find out what were the effects of these representations on the immigrants themselves. Although when we applied when we sent our application for this project, we talked about the impact of this coverage on integration, we soon realized that integration is a very narrow term to capture the range of experiences about what it means and how it feels to be an immigrant. That's why we now talk about sense of belonging and even a sense of being at home. I'm not going to spend much time on the methodology, but this is just to let you know that we analyzed over 200 articles in depth. These articles were selected from 3 national newspapers, Aftenposten, VG, and Klassekampen, over a time frame of 15 months between 2020 and 2021. We also talked to 23 immigrants from a variety of nationalities. I want to get immediately to the results. So what we found in analyzing the media coverage was that there was a very consistent narrative of a pure and healthy inside of the country, everything that was Norwegian, and that was during the pandemic being threatened and also contaminated by the infection that was brought on by individuals that were non-Norwegian or were coming from outside. In the coverage, there was also a very present association, constant association of infection to non-Norwegians, and particularly individuals non-born in Norway, and with specific ethnic minorities, particularly Somali, Pakistani, and at some points also Polish. The coverage was consistently racist, and we analyzed different features of the coverage, including headlines, the topics that were mentioned in the articles, also sources, the order information was presented in the articles, and many more features. What was most interesting about this was that for our interviewees, none of this was surprising. In fact, from their perspective, it was quite obvious. And they said that actually during the pandemic, the coverage became slightly worse, but actually that's the way the coverage is at all times. In fact, some of them, they said, well, we're being blamed again, here we go again. However, when we have presented these results before, particularly Norwegians, ethnic Norwegians, if you want to call them that way, they are really quite surprised about the results because they hadn't seen anything wrong actually with the coverage. And it's really clear that also journalists and editors, they didn't see anything wrong in the way they were writing the articles. In fact, to the point that when we presented these results before, one of the editors of those national mainstream newspapers told us that we were overinterpreting the coverage. But actually, we have the evidence of the objective features of the coverage, and so the coverage was unmistakably racist, and that was not just a problem of language, but also of the assumptions in between the lines, behind the text, and also in the back of the mind of the journalists and editors that produced this coverage. I'm going to present you just one example. So I repeat that this is one example of many more that we could make, and this is representative of a trend that was actually consistent over 15 months of coverage. The example is related to the publication of a cartoon. So as the title there says, this illustration was stopped, because initially this cartoon was not published. But then the editor, the political editor of Aftenposten decided to go ahead anyway, and this piece is an explanation of why he decided to go ahead. So these are just some excerpts of this article. So as the editor writes, it shows two women on a zebra crossing. One wears a chador, an item of clothing that is used by some Muslim women also in Norway. The other has a face mask. One covers most but the face. The other takes responsibility not to spread the infection. So as you see, the assumption is that one is taking responsibility, the other one is not. The illustration is made in a light tone. It is good. The usage of the chador and the mask is a play with form. The drawing is not malicious in any way. It is satire. It sharpens the things. It caricatures. It is the take of the cartoonist, and the cartoonist must have the freedom to use such tools. This is about what freedom of expression and freedom of the press should mean in our society today. I write this also because I have a serious concern that we're going to become too careful or too preoccupied to offend someone. So this shows well, first, that there is the belief that if you don't want to offend, then you're not going to cause offense, which actually is not true. And the fact that freedom of expression is the freedom of saying anything. So it consists effectively in the freedom from the consequences of that expression. But this shows also a rhetorical feature that we have observed in the coverage, and that consists in denial of racism when followed by a statement that actually represents racism. So also in this case, so there is a denial. This is not offensive in any way, but that's exactly what it is. So this was just one example. But I want to move on to the results of the interviews. One might think that the media is, the purpose of the media is to inform about what's happening in the world, and that's for sure the case. However, what's in the media also tells you whether the world around you, the society around you, is safe, whether you can feel at home in that society. So it provides also the existential coordinates of our lives, affecting our sense of safety and even our sense of well-being, including our health. I have an example here of the extent to which the racist media discourse has devastating consequences, and I underline devastating, on all domains of life of those who are exposed to it. This is a statement from an interviewee who is born in Norway and has an Eritrean background. So as he puts it, the racist coverage affects all spheres of your life because you start hearing it in your workplace, Norwegian while people discussing your migrant community and how the immigrants are dangerous, or that people should stay away from this and this group and not to date that and that group. So it's like it affects the whole culture, especially when it has to do with rape and that somehow minorities are seen as having less respect for a woman's body or being kind of more aggressive towards women. So that means that when you're at a party with ethnic Norwegians, you don't have to worry about getting raped. But when you are with immigrants, you have to worry that someone will rape you. We further looked at different dimensions of belonging. They include, for example, identity or how you relate to others, or even whether you feel economically secure. And the racist coverage affects all of these dimensions. Again, I don't have the time to go in depth into any of this, but I'm presenting just one example per these dimensions, and there are more actually. For example, when it comes to identity, the racist coverage, in the words of a participant in our study from Iraq, he said, I feel it in my body, in my soul, in my mind. It made me feel worthless. It made me feel the bad guy. It made me feel nobody. It changed me totally. Of course, if you're stigmatized in the news, or if your group is stigmatized in the news, you hardly can feel welcome. And some of our interviewees felt that they needed to get out and maybe write kronikker, so comment articles in the news, or take part in conversations to actually defend their group, because they said, if we don't do that, there will be more racism in the future. And of course, when you're always presented as a suspicious and dangerous other, it will be more difficult for you to find a job in the future. As one of our participants, who is also a politician, put it, she said, you might want to ignore what's in the media, but you know that you don't have this luxury because what's in the media will affect your life. This also affected the plans for the future of some of our interviewees. For example, one Dutch participant from Holland and another one from the US were considering taking Norwegian citizenship. And after having witnessed the coverage during the pandemic, they no longer want to do that as a political statement. Of course, when you are treated like this, also your rights and freedoms are affected, to the point that some of the interviewees, in fact, most of them, they felt they were being watched by the majority and they didn't have the same freedom of movement because of this surveillance that were going on, because of this climate of suspicion. And of course, all of this reflects back on your identity. As another participant put it in strong words, fuck my Norwegian side. Norway has never recognized me, so I'm done struggling to prove to people how Norwegian I am. So I don't say norsk iraker anymore. I identify as Iraqi. So to conclude, we're not here to blame the media and journalists, because they also have internalized a mindset that is much broader than them, and it involves the whole of society. However, the media have ethical responsibilities. They need to become aware of their mindset and to challenge it. So the media, as I said, has a key role in reproducing the standards of normality, including its racist bias. And it is actually no exaggeration, as things stand now, to say that mainstream media discourse actually is undermining Norwegian democracy, precisely because it's supporting this divisive mindset. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. So I'll leave the stage to Michelle.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. And as usual, I have too many objects to have on the surface that I have in front of me. This is a constant challenge, that I have too many things that fit on the surface that I'm going to use, because I have lots of stuff. Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to share with you today, is someone going to keep time for me? Thank you. Can I know when I have like 3 minutes left? Thank you. I'm going to share today reflections about my meeting with heritage during my career here, working and engaging with different heritage institutions, both in my capacity as a research librarian at the National Library, where I've worked for 15 years, but also in relation to a documentation project that I started 3 years ago, based on my experience working in and engaging with heritage institutions. Interesting. I'm just going to check here where. Okay, well. This is not the presentation that I thought that I sent, but I'm going to talk from this one, so it will be a little bit out of sync. I probably sent you the wrong file, but no worries. I'm going to make this work. As you can see, the title of this actual presentation is Mapping Black Oslo. And I was going to mention Mapping Black Oslo at the end of my presentation, but I'll just turn the whole presentation around and I'll mention this one first. 2 years ago, I received a call for papers, and it was for a book project called Mapping Black Europe. And I was intrigued because this is one of the many examples I've seen of a new conversation being started about heritage preservation and production in Europe that focuses and centers Black and African and Afro-diasporic experiences and histories. So when I received the call for papers, I received it 3 times, and no one in my network had committed to writing the chapter called Mapping Black Oslo. So I contacted the editors, Dr. Natasha Kelly in Berlin, and Professor Olive Vassell, who works out of Washington, D.C., but is originally from London. And they agreed that I would be allowed to write the chapter about Black Oslo, even though I'm not a native of Oslo. I'm born in Houston, Texas, but have lived in Norway for the past 20 plus years. And in working on this chapter, in which I write about these examples of Black political representation in the city of Oslo, and I go in and interpret different ways of defining what is Black political representation and why is it important. I start with, I should say that they wanted each author to do a status update on the situation of Black representation and definitional power as a result of summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd. So each chapter was asked to summarize the status of Black political representation and the presence, the markings, either in the public space or through heritage production, of Black representation in your respective city. So I speak about the demonstration organized by the African Student Association at the University of Blindern and the organization Arise, Africans Rising in Solidarity and Empowerment, on the 5th of June 2020, and that's in front of Stortinget at Eidsvollsplass. I speak about, I write about the Congo Landsby art project and its reference to the original amusement park staged Congolese village. I write about Ruth Ann Reese, who was born in 1956 in Hayneville, Alabama, and migrated to Oslo, or to Norway, in 1956, November 1956, and lived here throughout her life and became a civil rights activist and a public educator about African American history and anti-racism. And I also write about the mural, The Sky's the Limit, which is painted by the artist Fadlabi and is in Tøyen. And then the next example that I write about is the bust of Benjamin Hermansen, as examples of monuments and the public presence of Black history and Black political representation in Norway. And those examples were very important to me because what I've discovered through my engagement with heritage is that there's actually quite a bit of remarkable collections and material in Norwegian heritage institutions, both the National Library, the city archives, and several of the university libraries have quite remarkable collections that go back to the colonial era and that actually show quite an engagement between Norway, Africa, the African diaspora, and different manifestations of the ongoing and troubled relationship between Europe and different regions. And what I understood is that not only is there very relevant material in these collections, but it's that there are not enough people who are qualified to assess the material and to then use the material in the education of the public. That job is left to researchers to do. But if the researchers don't know that the material is actually in the collections, how do they know that they can actually use it? So you end up with a problem of the chicken and the egg. What comes first? The heritage promotion, the collection, the analysis, or the research? And how is are the current collections being interpreted and used in different examples of heritage production today in Norway? That's kind of what I've been grappling with. So I have many examples of my personal engagement with heritage. For example, coming to work one day and finding a folder on my desk with a lot of documents in it And my colleague said, well, I thought that you would know what to do with this. Someone brought it up from a different department, the archive department, and they were going to, this was going to be de-accessed, I'll put it that way, de-acquisitioned, because this was deemed as not belonging to the archive that they found it in. That material was about, were pamphlets related to African liberation that a Norwegian journalist had brought back with him from London, where he had spent time in the 1930s and 40s, was there during the Second World War, and he became quite engaged and friendly with the group of young British Commonwealth revolutionaries. So we're talking Jomo Kenyatta, Nehru, George Padmore, the Pan-Africanists and the liberation thinkers for the British Commonwealth. So these documents basically were evidence of a very, very critical and crucial period in Pan-Africanism in the world, but had a particular link to Norway. One of the people represented in that material was George Padmore, who then became friendly with Evard Holm, and they exchanged lots of letters that went through the late 40s to the mid 50s, where they're discussing African liberation, the process after the Second World War here in Norway, and how Norway was dealing with Quisling and the Nazi supportive contingency that was in Norway at the time. But they were basically having large conversations about very important issues of the time. And so much that George Padmore was invited by Ivar Holm here to Norway in 1937 to visit and to lecture at different studentersamfunn organizations, Oslo, Ås, Trondheim. And he held a series of lectures where he spoke about white civilizations in black lands. He was talking about and questioning European concepts of democracy in 1937, at a time when many European countries still held colonies in Africa and other places. So he was here in Norway and did a tour and basically spoke quite frankly about the hypocrisy and the effects and the long heritage of colonialism and the responsibility of the Nordic region particularly to be a voice for of solidarity with colonized peoples. So that was a discourse that was here in Norway in 1937, and which continued and, became, I saw very clear examples of this when I got to the archive of Ruth Rees, which is at the Oslo City Archives. And when I started engaging with the work of the private archive of Ruth Rees, what I thought I could not have imagined what I was going to encounter of history of the history of anti-racism in Norway coming together in her archive. And what I discovered is that, again, here I am, one person who is engaging with different kinds of information, whereas my colleagues in these different institutions don't have a chance to really engage with and share this information with the public, because the recruitment and the hiring is not supporting the needs of the institution, but also the institutions are sometimes not aware of their own needs. So through engaging with this work, Ruth Rees, who was a member of Artists for Liberation, where she worked together with Cliff Mustache from Nordic Black Theater in the 80s. She put out her autobiography in 1985. She was a published short story writer here in Norway. And already in 1958, she says, it's difficult to be a Negro also in Norway. So there were very strong anti-racism, social justice discourses that people from the diaspora were bringing with them and sharing with the public, and that has continued through today. The reason I mention this is because when we get to 2020, And you have the large protest, and you have the protests during COVID, which was also an issue with the demonstration where 15,000 people came out, is that it happened in the middle of COVID. And that received as much attention as the actual purpose and kind of intentions behind the demonstration. So, there was a lot of talk of discourses and attitudes being imported from the United States that was fueling the racism debates in the summer and fall of 2020. But what I learned through looking at the work of Ruth Reese is that those discourses were here long before 2020, and the inspiring each other and sharing information and sharing discourses has always been a part of social justice movements and anti-racism around the world. These movements have always been connected, and what I hope you don't need to see that. That was from the other presentation. What I hope is that the posters from that from that demonstration became an exhibition, which is being taken down today at BMUSEM. It's been up for a whole year. And basically what I learned is that if you want to be able to research and write certain histories, then you have to do your own documentation work, and you have to share those skills with other people, because our institutions are unable to meet the needs of society, all on their own. So, yeah, thanks for listening, and I hope that some of this just helps to give a different perspective of how heritage is important for us in everyday life. And these are just some of my reflections from my career so far. Thanks.
Hello everyone, and thanks for inviting me. I'm a historian of science, and I just published this book, Race, a History of Science. And as a historian, I'm not really an expert on contemporary Norway, but I may be able to bring some historical perspectives and facts that up like that. Is it better? Yeah. So I will just say a few words about race and Norwegian nationhood, historically and today. Just a few. In Norway today, it's not very common to use the term race in political or public discussions or in social scientific research. And racial categories are never used in statistics. But it hasn't always been like this. In the late 19th and early 20th century, membership in an assumedly superior white race was probably a self-evident and undisputed prerequisite for being considered a Norwegian. It was also common to think that the Norwegians had their roots in a subgroup of the white race, the so-called Nordic or Germanic race, which many saw as a racial elite within the white race and which supposedly constituted the core racial element of Northern European nations and the USA. It is, of course, important to point out that have I also sent you the wrong? No, just not a little bit out of sync here. This is the white race. This is the Nordic race, and this is the Norwegian nation, so to speak. So I mean, it's very important to point out that race was, of course, only one of a number of features that defined your Norwegianness. It was not your racial identity, but your assumed real or real historical, cultural, and linguistic characteristics that defined the Norwegians as a separate people distinct from other Germanic peoples. But even if not being a decisive criterion for Norwegianness, the racial aspects of nationhood had significant implications, especially for minority groups, the Roma, the Romani, the Jews, the Forest Finns, the Kvenes, and the Sami. These were seen as racially different and in varying degrees also as racially inferior to the Norwegians. They were neither Nordic Germanic nor white, but commonly classified within the so-called Asiatic or Mongoloid race. So this means that the important dividing line between whites and non-white races cut right through the Norwegian population. And this had deep implications for attitudes towards the non-Norwegian Norwegians. So what happened to race after World War II? Early 20th century mainstream racial thinking had in general been underpinned by mainstream science. But after the Second World War, scientific racism was severely undermined by science. In 1950 and 51, two statements about the scientific consensus on the race issue was published. And this was, of course, a reaction to Nazism, but also a product of decolonization and the rise of new nations, former colonies that gained their own voice in the international community. So anti-racism was strongly connected to anti-colonialism. But the statement was also based on new scientific developments, such as the rise of population genetics. And this, of course, was the United Nations that was behind this project, the UNESCO organization. So the main point in this statement was that there is no scientific evidence for psychological differences between races, and you can't talk about inferior and superior races. And there are also no clear-cut boundaries between races. But in spite of these arguments, the UNESCO experts claim that actually biological races do exist, and the concept of race was reproduced in biological sciences up into the 1970s, 1980s. And it's still a discussion to what extent these sciences have done away with race. But in parallel with the continuation of biological race science, the UNESCO statement also led to the development of social scientific and historical research on racism and to the rise of the concept of race as a social construct, or as Ashley Montagu put it, race, man's most dangerous myth. And these new research traditions gained a particular foothold in the UK and the USA and helped to give birth to racial studies as a thriving social scientific research field. But what about Norway? So while biological race science became increasingly marginalized in Norway after the war, social science arose as an influential field of research and theoretical input to public and political discourses on minority-related issues in Norway. And these disciplines were strongly inspired by the American social sciences. But in contrast to the USA, the study of race as a social, cultural entity never gained a foothold in Norwegian academia. This seems to imply that the Norwegian academics tended to assume that racial issues were something that only existed elsewhere, such as in South Africa or the USA, and that research and academic discourse on minorities in Norway was no longer seen as racial issues. In 1970, with the Norwegian ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the term race was taken into the Norwegian straffelov, the penal code. But the white paper that prepared this ratification, race was defined as a biological fact, not as a social construct. And Norwegian minorities in the interwar years definitively had been racialized. They were now defined not as races, but as ethnic groups. And then later in 2008, even the term race was taken out of the penal code, and at about the same time, race was also removed from other laws that address discrimination in Norway. Instead of race, ethnicity came in as a key concept in the laws. And this use of ethnicity was in line with the general trend before the 1970s. Ethnicity was a purely academic term, but since the 1980s, it has appeared with a rapidly increasing frequency in the Norwegian public debate. And as it has moved from the academic sphere into everyday use, it has become a very ambiguous term that may refer to language, culture, and so on, but also to notions about biological ancestry. And as such, it has many affinities to the race concept. In contrast to race, however, it is not taboo to talk about ethnicity. So the term ethnic Norwegian is commonly used to denote people with deep family roots in Norway, but it's also strongly associated with whiteness. While Norwegians with European or Anglo-American ancestry can easily pass as ethnic Norwegian, this is not necessarily so for Norwegians with African, Latin American, or Asian ancestors. So Norwegian nationhood today is not intertwined with race in the same way as it was in the interwar years, and ideas about Nordic Germanic supremacy, which once was part of mainstream culture, is now mainly maintained within extreme groups. But this does not, I think, mean that Norwegian society is colorblind. Skin color and external physical features invoke notions about ancestry, identity, and belonging, and affect the interaction between people. So in spite of the numerous black Norwegians, and in spite of a strong drive to develop a colorblind society, there is still an ambiguous conceptual connection between whiteness and Norwegianness. So, do I have more time? Yeah. So in her doctoral thesis, the sociologist Laura Führer interviewed Norwegians with and without immigrant background about the social meaning of skin color. And she found, among other things, that terms used to describe belongingness to the nation, such as norsk, utlending, or innvandrer, had many layers of meaning related to language, culture, religion, and ancestry, but also to skin color and other bodily characteristics. She also argued that ethnic norsk, it is an ambiguous category which both points at and obscure the significance of skin color and bodily features. And as such, it helps to reproduce a notion about Norway as a colorblind society, and also to obscure the fact that race still matters, even in Norway. So, thank you for the attention.
Yeah. So I work in teacher education, and that means that I do my research also in relation to schools, kindergartens, and so on. And I also do work with developing teaching materials, because I do think that it's important as a researcher in the education field to also kind of involve themselves with the actual field. So what I'm going to talk about now is a combination of insights from my research and my work in developing teaching material and visiting schools and so on. So in a 7th grade social studies class, the students are exploring the topic of transatlantic slavery. In a clever way, the teacher connects the historical process of European slave trade from the 1500s to the present and modern-day slavery. But the textbook steers the focus of the conversation in a somewhat different direction. Information about colonialism and slavery is provided in a chapter titled The Great Explorers. Now, this story of European colonialism as a major achievement of alleged great white men has proven tenacious in educational narratives and is rarely questioned, but treated simply as sort of the facts of world history. So as the teacher tells her students, today we're going to learn about the Europeans who discovered the world. In this narrative, the coming of modernity, Western science, and industrialization that was made possible by these processes is presented as the trajectory of human development and infinite progress. At one point during the class, a student raises her hand and asks, "But who discovered Norway then?" The teacher hesitates and answers, "I don't think anyone really discovered Norway. It is more that different people have been living here for thousands of years. We don't usually talk that way about Europe." So my point here is not to tell you that this story is wrong, because in some ways it is not. From the perspective of a certain group of European white men, this is indeed the way the story looks. I rather want you to focus your attention towards how limited this narrative is and how it only enables to understand the events from a very particular standpoint. The challenge with this is also how this standpoint becomes universalized as what is perceived to be the objective facts. And so this is what I think the very honest and in many ways very accurate answer from the teacher illustrates when she says, "This is not the way we talk." I also want you to pay attention to the absences in the story, because this way of telling the story also enables the erasure of millions of people and their knowledges through the common framing of the so-called doctrine of discovery that was central in colonialism, as if the people already living in these areas, as well as the enslaved human beings and their histories, knowledges, and cultures did not exist. And what also remains unacknowledged is how these processes installed prevailing Eurocentric modes of economic and also epistemological domination, so in terms of knowledge. And this epistemological domination was also then based on ontological deprivation, and this means the impossibility of acknowledging the full humanity of brown, black, and indigenous bodies within this kind of logic, so in other words, racism. Much research argues that there are aspects of history and society that are made absent in and through educational narratives in Norway. So the concept of colonialization is not included in the curriculum and not commonly discussed. And the concepts of race and racism are reserved to people and places in other contexts, in past times, concerning massive atrocities such as genocide or apartheid. And the absences do not only concern information about historical events and dynamics in society, but also the absence of the non-white, indigenous, and to a certain extent also female bodies as actual knowledge producers. So for example, even if the history of Norwegianization of Sápmi is often mentioned, this is done devoid of Sami politicians or agents or protagonists in these stories. And so, as I argue, these absences cannot be understood as coincidental, not least because they appear systematically in the curriculum. They are what Gayatri Spivak describes as sanctioned ignorances. So this means a purposeful silencing through the dismissing of particular peoples, events, and contexts as irrelevant. And so this is not necessarily an issue of individual malice, but an institutionalized way of thinking. So through these absences, we learn to see and know the world in specific ways that prioritize and acknowledge certain subjects and exclude and externalize others. So I think that the challenges with this situation is twofold. So it both regards how children does not actually get access to quality and accurate knowledge about history and society, but it also has a moral dimension in terms of the access to feeling acknowledged and empowered as a knowledge subject and recognizing yourself in the curriculum as a school child. What these sanctioned ignorances also do is to help keeping effective equilibriums in place, so enabling belonging and stability of self-understandings for some, but at the same time also constructing exclusions. So this way they uphold the white majority emotional comfort zone where whiteness is the invisible norm. And this includes the national imaginary of Norway being an inherently good nation state and society free of colonial legacies and racism. And when racism or coloniality then are mentioned or actualized implicitly or explicitly, this amounts to disturbance of these equilibriums that then create discomfort. And this is what comes to the fore when the ones hit by racism are also given the blame when they call out and talk about it. So we know that education and schools are arenas where students, children, do experience racism. And this happens even though all schools would state themselves as non-racist and are subject to an Education Act that is entrenched in principles of human rights and dignity. And so mechanisms that I observed in my research was, for example, the downplaying of or lack of acknowledgement of racist comments towards minoritized students by stating that racism was probably not the intention or that racism is too serious to be relevant to this context. Or the notion that being accused for racist statements is worse than actually experiencing these. Or then the externalization of racism as something that happens other places. And I also experienced this when I argued that racism must be thematized also with the young children, when I'm then sometimes accused of introducing bad news or unnecessary discomfort. But what remains unacknowledged in this picture is that many young children already do experience racism and hence cannot choose to avoid this discomfort. And I have to say something happened with my slides as well, but I think it will be fine. Yeah. Lastly, I want to point out that I think it is vital to recognize racism as a societal and structural challenge that needs societal, political, material solutions, and that the focus on working with attitudes and knowledge is sometimes sort of overrated, and sometimes I also think that it works to alleviate the institutional structural responsibilities. But still, even though knowledge and education does hold power relations in place, it can also open up possibilities for change. So I think that education could be an arena that holds open spaces for grappling with racism and colonialism and cultivates relations of solidarity and dignity. Education against racism is not an education where, as many schools would argue, racism and coloniality does not exist, or some kind of a colorblind sphere, because this is not really possible. Talking about colorblindness and zero tolerance zones for racism contribute to upholding the sanctioned and invisible reproduction of it. So I think that education should rather be an anti-racist education, so a space for active anti-racist actions and for reimagining futures not supported by racial domination or colonial structures of knowledge and being. Thank you.
Okay. So, everyone can hear me, I hope. Thank you, Banafshe and Christina, for inviting me to say a few words about implicit bias or unconscious bias in relation to healthcare. It is in our very nature as human beings that we constantly make more or less well-considered generalizations when interacting with other people. Psychologists refer to such subconscious thought processes based on pattern recognition as unconscious or implicit bias. The phenomenon also manifests itself when doctors or other healthcare workers meet with patients. But are they, or me, aware of how this affects their professional practice? To illustrate for you what implicit or unconscious bias is, I would like to take you on a short trip in your own mind. You do not have to, but closing your eyes may help you visualize the following scenario. So if you're ready. You're going on a holiday. You are a little bit late setting out, but you make it to your flight after stressing to get to your gate on time. You slump back into your seat and catch your breath as the cabin crew perform their routine safety instructions. Very important, obviously. Soon your plane is taken off and the familiar voice of the captain comes over the tannoy with the usual welcome speech telling your passengers how fast the plane is flying and how high and most importantly, the expected time of arrival at your holiday destination. Seated next to you is a surgeon who sits reading a copy of The Lancet throughout the flight. Arriving at your destination, you go to a restaurant and you order your favourite holiday meal. Can you imagine that? Can you smell it? In the table next to you stand a couple who are delighted to be celebrating their 10-year anniversary together. They share out bottles of champagne to the tables around them. Okay, so try and keep all these things I've said in your mind, and then when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So, just questions really. In your mind's eye, were the cabin crew grey-haired? Or did they have punk-style haircuts? Did the captain, when they were talking, have a female voice? Was the surgeon a man? And did he or she have the same skin colour that you have? The couple celebrating their wedding anniversary, did they have the same sex? You remember how I was presented at the beginning, married, 50 years old. How many of you have assumed that my partner is a woman and that my children are biologically connected to me as opposed to adopted? Your assumptions would probably be right, because my wife's sitting right here. But the point is that the world you visualize is a construction of what you expect, and it's based on your experiences that you've absorbed through an environment, through life. To imagine anything else actually feels different. It requires more energy. I don't know if you remember when I mentioned, when I was introduced, my age was mentioned. Can you remember how old I was? Yeah. And can you remember how tall I was? Right. Okay. Like who puts their age in a bio? I mean, not age. Who puts their height in a bio? It's totally irrelevant. So that took your attention. Okay. If I'd been on a Tinder, it would just mean, I'm just swipe to the left. Right. The point is that, so when we're confronted with something unexpected, it dominates our attention, and the rest, no matter how important the details, falls into the background. And this can result in subtle or obvious changes in the way we behave or think. And what is this feeling or intuition, gut sense, tension, whatever we call it? Our unconscious processes are full. These are unconscious processes, and they're full of bias, and they can make us prejudicial. Without these rapid unconscious thought processes, we would be dead as a species. We can't, certain situations like the one noted there, we can't use time for cognitive thought. So our unconscious does the work for us. The amygdala is a part of our brain that decides for us which observed patterns of behaviors can be trusted, or just patterns basically, and what is a potential threat. Amongst other things, the amygdala helps us interpret emotions expressed in the face we see in front of us. The more unfamiliar the face, the harder it is for the amygdala to find confirmation of trust. And without sensing trust, our bodies stay on the alert. So basically, it's simply drawbridge up as opposed to drawbridge down. Our conscious brain cannot beat our unconscious brain when it comes to speed or the amount of processing it takes on board. Yes, we may be liberated, reasoning, free thinkers, but our unconscious brains have created the emotional and physiological backdrop, or call it weather, if you like, the environment in which our conscious thoughts and decisions take form. It's beyond our control. Our human unconscious divides the people we meet into those that fit into our in-group, and the unfamiliars end up in our out-group. What qualifies the in-group is based on experience. It's not fixed or final, and it's certainly not genetic. In so being, our in-group can evolve and grow with new experiences, which is good, if it's allowed to. Those that belong in our in-group mentality contain more nuance. We are capable of distinguishing between these people, attributing them with individual and often positive qualities. In contrast, those unfamiliar faces that land in our out-group receive less nuance and more categorical group qualities. The details of their faces are harder to recognize. That they all look alike is not true, but your brain might experience it so. Is this? Yeah, okay. This is a painful fracture for whoever you are. It's been shown in the US that if the owner of this fracture is categorized as black or Latino, when they go to hospital, they'll get less pain relief compared to if this fracture is owned by a person with white skin. The same bone, same type of fracture, but the different consideration of pain relief by the doctors treating these people. There could be various explanations for this, but here's another example. In this study, a cohort of doctors, a group of doctors, family doctors, were asked to consider whether a patient's history was suggestive of cardiac disease and maybe needed referral to a cardiologist. As a group, they each heard exactly the same story, spoken to them by one of the 6 different actors shown, people that were different according to gender and skin color. The group of doctors showed that the patient that was white-skinned and male was most likely to be referred to a cardiologist, while if the patient was female or with brown skin, or most of all, if with both, they were least likely to be referred. This is not just personal bias amongst these doctors, it is also bias that is learned from medical training. To illustrate the bias in medical training, just a quick example, I'd like, well, if those of you that wish, to get out your smart telephones and go to your Google engine images, and then type in the word, in Norwegian it'd be eksem, or eczema in English. And basically, you don't have to do it, but basically, if you just scroll down, you'll see masses and masses of pictures of eczema on white-colored skin. You might see 1 or 2 with brown skin, but it's mostly white skin. If you Google eczema brown skin, you'll find masses of pictures of eczematous lesions on people with brown skin. But as a doctor, you may not recognize that as eczema because it's not something you've been exposed to early on in your education that helps you recognize it unconsciously and quickly, which is what doctors do. They are pattern recognitions. So they depend very much on their unconscious processes. Yeah. So it doesn't even matter if the doctor has the same skin color as me. If they haven't been taught, if their environment hasn't taught them that this is eczema on brown skin, then they won't know what it is when they're presented it by a patient with brown skin. So that's how you can get disparities in healthcare without active racism. And just these are examples of, the UK examples of medical institutions addressing the issue of unconscious bias, both in training and in practice. Something we need more of here. In 2020, the American Medical Association declared racism as a threat to public health. It's not just a nasty moral thing. It's actually unhealthy, and it's a threat to public health. The Norwegian Institute of Public Health has voiced the same concern. And so far, I've concentrated on how healthcare workers discriminate, the majority of whom do so without necessarily any malicious intent. But I'd like to close with a reminder of how the experience of discrimination, whether racist or otherwise, can affect individuals' health. I'd like to refer everybody to this Harvard professor, Dr. David Williams. He's spent a lifetime researching the association of hard, like my height, it's a measured out. It's something you can't contest. I am 177 tall, and he's looked at hard outcomes, medical outcomes, and compared them to people who experience discrimination through validated questionnaires, which show that they have a good validity and reproducibility. So his methods are published online and can be utilized here in Norway by researchers that are interested in this. And it would seem that some researchers have been sailing in the same wind, because this study is from Norway, and it's not to do with people with brown skin. It's to do with the Sami people, and this is a study looking at cardiovascular disease in a broad sort of population questionnaire, looking at hard outcomes like heart attacks or strokes, high blood pressure, and basically what they found is that if Sami people living in Norwegian majority areas who experienced themselves discrimination had a higher prevalence of cardiovascular disease compared to Sami people living in rural areas where Samis were majority. So, and they controlled for all other sort of lifestyle issues and this sort of thing. So their conclusion was that it could be the effect of marginalization or discrimination that had an impact on health outcomes. As a response to the verbal and physical racist abuse leveled at writer Sumaya Ali, I wrote about the documented effect of racism on, amongst other things, the degeneration of your chromosomes, the genetic material of your cells. So at a genetic level, this genetic phenomenon is also associated when you do studies of people experiencing loneliness and depression. And let's see, where was I? Yeah. So I'll just finish off, because I think Sumaya Ali's words put so simply and so clearly in her latest book, which is very worthwhile reading, especially about children's experience of racism and growing up. She's put so simply and clearly the evident mechanism through which experienced, in her case, racist discrimination affects individual health. And she writes, «Jeg mener at rasisme som fenomen intensivering av menneskelig ensomhet.» And did everybody understand that? Or do you want me to try? She says, I believe that racism as a phenomenon intensifies the experience of human loneliness. And when you do studies of loneliness and depression, they are, in terms of their risk, your disease risk, cardiovascular risk, your risk of having a stroke or a heart attack, the experience of depression and loneliness over long periods of time, with that effect on your genetics, for example, when you measure, it's similar to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So this is why discrimination, whether it's racist or any other type, is a public health issue, because it does affect health. And that's why I am interested in it. So thank you, Sumaya, for putting it so succinctly. I couldn't have done it better. Yeah, thank you.
So I invite all the speakers to step in this. Yeah, please. Thanks to all of you. Really interesting, important, and maybe surprising at some points. So I have some questions for all of you. You may want to respond from your own perspective or from your own experience. The first question is, how does one become aware of the assumptions in the back of one's mind? As I say, you can speak based on your experiences in your special field. Yes, if we start with Jon, is this okay? How do you think we can actually become aware of the assumptions that are in the back of our minds?
Well, I suppose that the assumption that you're thinking of that are in the back of our minds, they are out there in society. That's why they are also in the back of our minds. So I think that first thing we'll have to do is to start questioning the, taken for given assumptions in the society you live in, and studying its history, and we need kind of historical and social scientific research and so on these kind of issues. So, yeah.
And when this history is not actually available or accessible to the public, as for instance Michel said, how do you think it's possible to search for something that we don't actually know that exists about history? You can also respond.
Not sure if I really...
because you said that we can, by reading the history and by reading, by making ourselves more familiar with perhaps alternative standpoints or alternative histories, we can be more aware of the assumptions that are in the back of our minds. But what if history is written by is not accessible? This history that we need to read and we need to reach is not accessible to public. First, it could be because there are not many, perhaps the data or the material, as Michel said, is not really available, or it's just archived for ages, or not many researchers actually look for this material. So how is this possible to, how we as researchers can actually make something public that have been hidden for so many ages?
Well, I can answer as a historian. Of course, it's up to us to ask new questions, to confront existing narratives, and say deconstruct them and look for new types of sources, and so it's yeah.
So I assume you see a sort of social responsibility for the researcher to seek for this data or material.
Yeah, of course, that's, for example, why I've written this book that I spent 15 years on writing. Yeah. So I think that's our obligation. I mean, historians, we construct narratives, and we have a long history of the field of history has always been strongly intertwined with nation building. So historians kind of have a responsibility for having, as a profession or as a discipline, for having constructed kind of national narratives that we are surrounded by and that are in the back of our heads. And this, it is of course our responsibility to have a critical reflection upon what these narratives are, about their accuracy, but also about what kind of role they play in society, and to ask questions about the past that is relevant to the present, and always kind of engage in this dialogue with the past. And every new generation of historians should ask new questions, and yeah. Yeah.
Kristin?
Yeah, I think it's enormously important, this work on documentation, and as Michelle talked about, and I really recognize this from developing textbooks for school and trying to find these stories that we know are there, but that we need the documentation, right? So that's something. But thinking about more kind of the how do you become aware of what's in the back of our heads, and that question, and going more to the day-to-day, everyday encounters, thinking about education, schools, kindergartens. I think that one thing is to sort of, it might sound paradoxical, but normalize racism as something that exists. Because what I observed in my research is that it's not talked about that much, and then there's this certain discomfort around it, and the teachers and maybe also kindergarten teachers are afraid that they will introduce something that is bad for the children, and you know, they're innocent and all that. But what happens is that, of course, children notice differences. They talk about it, for example, skin color and so on, and then they're told that you're not supposed to talk about it. And especially a lot of the children associated Muslim and black with being bad words. And this teaches them, of course, implicitly, these value hierarchies of human beings, right? Because there's nothing wrong with talking about skin colors, for example, but this is, so I think that is one thing, at least, to kind of acknowledge that this is, you know, part of everyday life. Yeah.
Michelle?
I think what it has required of me is a lot of uncomfortable conversations and pointing out when is something an authorized heritage discourse that's an accepted heritage narrative. And before, I didn't know how to have these conversations in Norwegian language. I was very hesitant because I thought that it would be perceived as being very harsh, or I didn't want to sound too critical in Norwegian. I was afraid that my vocabulary wouldn't allow me to choose nuanced words that would explain my perspective good enough. But at some point, I had to be okay with not having the perfect language for making my case. And so I just learned to start saying it's not a matter of what I believe, but what was my professional opinion about this? Because it was very difficult for people. I felt it was difficult for them to separate my personal opinion about the subject from my professional opinion about the subject. So I just had to start saying things like, how can you tell a story? What is Norwegian jazz? How do you talk about Norwegian jazz without telling the story of jazz being an African-American traditional folk music? Where does Norwegian jazz begin? And my jazz, my heritage with jazz, where does that begin? And is it okay? Is that ethical to make a distinction between Norwegian jazz and jazz that the world has inherited because it was created and born out of a particular socio-cultural, historical moment? And it just kind of, I felt that it was irresponsible. I got to a point where I felt it was irresponsible not to say something, not to make a certain point. So it really, yeah, I think the focus on youth and young people has become much more important to me as well. Instead of writing for colleagues, that I am choosing now to write for younger and younger audiences. And when it comes to the exhibition that is coming down at the Cultural History at the City Museum, I had to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations about how the school program was going to be built around that exhibition. And I was critical, and I had to become comfortable with being critical. Even though I was happy to have the collaboration, I felt that younger school children should be included in the audience for that exhibition. And in the end, it ended up being 10th grade and high school students. The exhibition was not targeting for the school program children in middle school and in grade school. So to me, that was a big loss, and I was very sad about that after putting so much work into a project and thinking that it could be beneficial for younger audiences, that everything you said about how younger people are experiencing and encountering racism in the schoolyard and in schools, I just felt it was a missed opportunity. And so what I've now decided to do is to focus more on children, because I can't be sure that even if I make an exhibition and get it into a museum, that will trickle down to opportunities for kids. So it's really about standing in the gap and being the example for the institutions that you hope one day will see that, oh, it's possible. If Michelle can do this, well, I'm a huge institution. Surely I can do 1% of what she's doing, with her savings.
Yes. I just respond because I think I recognize so much of what you're saying that, so when I was writing these textbooks, for example, I was told that I could not use the concept colonialism in a book for middle school, so 5th to 7th grade. And I had to kind of find my Sami historians and to kind of, legitimize this use of this concept. So it ended up that I used it. And then the same with racism, that, this was reserved for older children. And I was told, could I not talk more about friendship and being good friends? And of course I can talk about that, but that is something else. So I think this also, and the third thing was that in my research I also talked to the children, so the 5th to 7th graders, and there was a discrepancy between the teachers' images of racism not being relevant for them, and they very explicitly saying that this is something that concerns their everyday life, like the 10 to 12-year-olds. So yeah.
Christina?
Yes, so this question of becoming aware of these assumptions in the back of the mind is something we have discussed a lot in our project, and particularly in relation to journalists and editors. So for us, while of course educating children is very important, it's also very important to educate adults. And yes, and we have struggled with this question: how do we make adults aware of this, particularly media professionals? And we have actually tried to organize workshops to even present our results, but they haven't been very forthcoming, because it's what you mentioned so far many times, is the discomfort that is associated with this topic. I mean, this is really a barrier. So even just acknowledging that there is a problem and sitting with that discomfort is a start. But what we have observed also in the coverage was also this lack of actually basic curiosity towards the experience of the other. So one doesn't need to engage with racism, this big and scary world, but maybe it's just one needs to be a bit more curious, or just acknowledging that there is a different experience than your own. And what is this experience? And I mean, in the media, there seems to be this idea that you need more diversity. And diversity seems to consist in hiring brown or black bodies. And in fact, not even Eastern Europeans, not even whites. I mean, you need to be Muslim or dark skin somehow. And you need to be an expert somehow of a different culture. But yeah, that I don't think this is the point. We have discussed this a lot. It's really, again, basic curiosity about the other story and asking different questions. So there could have been so many new stories that could have been told during the pandemic, instead of blaming, this group has X amount of infections and the other group has X amount of infections. They don't care. They don't take it seriously. Well, a good question could have been, why is it possible that in a society that is supposed to be equal, some people are suffering more? So why can't we discover more? So there was a complete lack of context and a complete lack of explanations as to, okay, there might be proportionally higher infection rates in this group, but why? So that question was never really answered. So I think journalists can do better in that respect. So it's their point to dig and to find the story. So maybe we don't even need to think about the racism, but just thinking about curiosity towards the other.
Patty, can you tell us, how do you think, as a medical staff, for instance, how can you encounter racism in your, how has it been for you as experience to talk with this in your professional environment with other medical staff? Is it easy in Norway to talk about this topic at your job? How have you experienced this?
I didn't see that question coming. First of all, I'm not an expert. By the way, you introduced it. I'm not an expert. I just take an interest in this. I have a day job as an obstetrician. I think, I think I'd rather say that it's this. You were saying, mentioning that why do people don't need to be bothered to be curious, because if the system works to their benefit, then why, and they're comfortable, then why? What's the point of being curious? Curious to change, and then change creates maybe some discomfort, and it's not good for them. So I think that's one of the challenges. And when you do ask questions, that's also why you kind of get blamed, because people don't want you to, if it's not broken, don't fix it. But when it comes to, I think, I don't think I want to talk about personal anecdotes, because that's always I can, but I think from point of view of research, there is interesting research now coming out. It's not just the American stuff that I was referring to in my talk, but there are studies. The Norwegian Medical Register is respected around the world for its quality, its high quality of the data that's inside it. It's still got its flaws, but it's very well respected. So big observational data, looking at all these different variables in the patients that have, for example, in my field of childbirth, people are beginning to look at what happened, what the outcomes for patients in our hospitals, depending on whether they were born in Norway or not. Or from a low income or low to middle income country. Basically, if you're someone from abroad that's brown skinned, or if someone that's abroad from Europe, or someone that's abroad from Anglo-American, And for example, there are, and these are good because they basically, it's just data, and it shows something, it shows differences, and then people start to ask questions, and that's one good way. That you get research being done that just looks at your ethnicity or your birth, your fødeland, as one of many variables, and then sees if that makes a significant difference to your outcome in childbirth. So, for example, if you are from born in Africa or born, for example, in South Asia, and you give birth in Norway to your child, you're more likely than a woman who's born in Norway to experience a terrible tear in your birth canal. Most likely you won't, but the odds of you actually experiencing that are higher. When that's said, if your partner is born in Norway, he or she reduces your risk of having a tear. And that makes you wonder, what does that guy sitting in the corner of the delivery suite have to do with the midwife and the birth and the child coming out the birth canal? So there has to be something going on in the communication in that setting between the healthcare worker but we as healthcare workers see of ourselves as a standard. We're not a variable that can be different from time to time. We are in a sense a constant. And now we're beginning to see data that makes us challenge whether we are a variable influencing medical outcomes. And I think I mentioned also this with education. And also with education, there are a lot of myths that go around, even in medicine, and institutions can promote them. So the British Heart Foundation have guidelines suggesting that you don't provide ACE inhibitors, which is one of the best treatments for treating high blood pressure. Don't give it to a black patient if they come into your room. That's what your guideline tells you, based on research which just shows that there's some differences if you take a group of black-skinned patients from America and a group of white-skinned patients from America, that you might get a slight difference in response which in people with brown skin. It still means that the majority of people with brown skin will still benefit from that, but they don't get it because you're being told category. So, yeah, I'm babbling now.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I assume there are some questions from the audience.
Can I give you just one example of an anecdote?
Yeah, for
and
sure.
I'm not going to give this. This has just happened in the last 17 years. Handing over from the day to the shift coming on, and so maybe there's about 8 of us doctors sitting, and a colleague of mine refers to one of the patients. They can't remember the patient's name because it's been a very busy day and everyone's a bit kind of tired. And the patient is referred to as negressa. And I thought, what? Did I hear that? And then I heard it again, the negressa in the intensive care. And I said, and then I really felt, my heart was beating a bit, and I thought, I got to say something. So I said, would you mind choosing another descriptor to describe that patient if you can't remember their name? And then they asked me, well, what do you suggest? And I said, well, the person has brown skin like mine. I mean, that's a perfectly valid observation. And then I felt I was going to get into this kind of conversation about the word and this sort of thing. And I thought, this is about the patient. We need to look after the patients. This is a handover. This is medical stuff. The patients. So I said, would you use that descriptor that you just used in this room in front of or to the patient? And they said, no. And I said, well, then it's probably shouldn't be used here. So it just made it about not saying you're a bad person, you're a racist. He said, what you just said is, I think you could find something better. and then the question of whether it's appropriate or not. Well, would you use it in front of the patient? How would the patient feel? And I think most patients with brown skin would not feel. They would feel objectified if they were described with that word. And then you lose compliance with the patient. You lose trust. You lose medical outcome.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, how does this affect the sense of safety of patients in the medical center where they are there to be treated, or they are there to get healthier, but they actually feel even more unsafe. But yeah, you just mentioned it. Thanks.
Well, I wouldn't say this word was used in any kind of malice, but it was a throwback to a time when this was just a jargon. And you can open medical textbooks in Norwegian and you find this word. So this doctor's read this word in a medical textbook, which he or she was advised to read in order to get through exams. So it's also about kind of retraining people's mind.
Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Alfred, and I'm from Houston, Texas. And I want to thank my cousin Michelle for inviting me out. This has been very, very educational for me. It caught me completely off guard because I am surprised that, and I'm gonna have to be blunt. So where I come from, I live in black and white every day. That's my life, every day. And my kids, I have to tell my kids, my son from little, about how to deal with white people because that's what it is, you know what I'm saying? And I'm also a healthcare worker. And I've been a healthcare worker for 30 years. And I do radiology. I do CAT scans, MRI, stuff like that. So, man, it's like the patients, the white people don't want us to touch them. You know, the Muslim people don't want us to touch them. You know, it's crazy. And the people are sick. You know what I'm saying? The people sick and need help. But when I show up black, they be like, oh, no, don't touch me. I want to come off my skin. You know, just stuff like that, right? And so for me, myself, I even changed the way I walk, changed the way I talk, just to make white people feel comfortable, right? And so I got to a point like, well, wait a minute. You know, y'all just don't know that that's what it is because we deal with white people and try to wonder like, man, why are you treating me like this? Why are you doing that? But you never have to deal with me. It does not matter. Like, does he feel this way? Does she feel this way? So what I do at my job is I talk about it. Just like she was saying over there in my profession, because I feel it. So if I hear somebody say something, hey man, that's racial. You know what I'm saying? Hey man, that's racism. Racism, yeah, you didn't know it because you don't have to live that way. And none of your friends. So why would you talk about it? That's just people from other places norm. You know what I mean? And so my question is there some kind of movement happening out here in Norway to where the people are starting to feel maybe uncomfortable or something? So you just kind of want to talk about like, well, wait a minute. Here come some other people. What's happening? Because in Texas, it's like that with the Mexicans and the people coming from Central America. And it's like the white people feel like they're being invaded by here come these people. Or you got to lock down the border. Or you got to, hey man, wait a minute. No, y'all the ones that's terrorizing the people. It ain't the people coming in. The people just trying to get in there and make a living, right? And so that's my thing. Is this like, because it's not a lot of like brown people here in Norway, because when I walked in the door of this building, I felt it immediately. When I hit your country, I'm like, whoa, what is going on out here? And I asked Michelle, I'm like, hey man, what's happening out here? They're not used to seeing black people? And when I walked in the door, I was like, whoa, hey man, are we in the right place? Like, what's going on? Because I live in black and white. And so my thought automatically is, you're racial. You're racist. Until I get to know you and you prove to me otherwise. So I just thought I'd just interject that because I'm saying I was very surprised when I came in. I was like, wow, these people really don't know? Yeah, man, it's for real.
He's
well,
been 24 hours, just FYI. Thank you, President. Yeah, you arrived yesterday. Straight from the airport to Litteraturhuset.
I got to Amsterdam. I'm like, whoa, who are these dudes? Come here, sir. Hey, hold on, wait a minute. Who are y'all? You know, I don't even know who these guys was. Interpol? Or something. Who was that? At the border? You remember when I came? I don't know who they were. I'm like, dude, what's up? Hey, can I see your passport, sir? Come here. Let me talk to you for a minute. Okay, well, what's up, man? How much money do you have in your pocket? Money I got in my pocket. Yeah, just different. Just so for y'all to think about, yes, it does happen in the world. And yes, it is in Norway. Because I've been here, 2 days? A day? A day. And I'm walking around like, man, what? Oh, is it cool over here? You know, yeah, so, yeah, it's here. That's all. Thank y'all for listening.
Questions? Marianne?
There was a question about, okay, yeah.
I just have two questions, one for Christina and one for Patty. Christina, you talked about media representation and consequences and effects of media representation. And I find it very, very interesting. It's like we have this sort of causal explanation of relation between media production, meaning production, media representation, and how they are perceived, and how they affect the society, how they affect the individuals. And it's like sometimes this causality logic is like if I have alcoholic and violent father, then the chances that I'm getting alcoholic and violent towards my own kids is greater, which we know today is not quite correct because there are so many different variables playing that I turn violent. So I would be very happy if you can say something about this, these causes and effects you talked about. And the question to Patty was, this, I don't know if I really perceived you right, the last quotation you had about racism as the result of intensifying human loneliness.
Okay, I'll explain.
Yeah, because I find it really problematic and in a way very difficult to perceive, because human loneliness can be because of narcissism, because I hate everybody, I think I am the best, and I go on my own way. It can be because of I don't understand the language, so I am lonely. There are so many reasons you can explain about mental and cognitive processes among individuals, why they are alone. But as far as I understand as a sociologist, racism is a result of intensifying power relations in each society. And it's very, very complicated. And that is why I bring up also this question of causality to Christina, because what you're saying, in fact, is that there are some cognitive processes, but at the same time, you use all sort of social, psychological, or sociologic examples, like how people behave in society. And it's always a challenge I have with friends, physicians or psychologists, friends and colleagues, because we don't understand each other. One thing is the cognitive process and mental evolution among individuals. Another thing is that these processes, they are not constructed in vacuum, but in relation to other people in a society, with people with so many different dispositions, with so many different constructions, and the picture is much more complicated than reducing it to question of loneliness or mental processes among individuals. So I would be very happy if you could elaborate a little bit more on that as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, I mean, we were talking about the impact of the news on the life of the immigrants, but we are not talking about this kind of cause-effect, very linear relationship, because first of all, the news is a reflection of the broader society. So it's not like we are looking at the effect of the news. The news is the way it is because the society is the way it is, and also. The reason why we organized this event today was also to show where these racist discourses exist elsewhere in society. So to also explain why do we have this racist discourse in the society. But what we were looking at was not just trying to detect the fact that the immigrants' thinking or cognitive aspect was affected. We were trying to find where this discriminatory racist news was fitting in their everyday life. So we start from the assumption that news is not just information that circulates and arrives in my brain and I interpret this information, but news really basically creates the reality and creates a world around me as an immigrant that might be very threatening. And this affects me in many different ways, not just cognitive ways. It can affect my health. It affects the way I move around, the way I keep on adjusting my mask, the way I feel I need to keep the distance from other people when I walk. So that's what we were trying to find out in these interviews, not just how the news affected their thinking. And we have plenty of material that shows the impact specifically of the news. Although it's not just the news, because the news is not just consumed by the immigrants, but also by the majority. And then the majority discriminates against the immigrants. So it's a vicious circle. I hope I have answered.
Yeah, I understand you perfectly well, but I agree with you that they are important in construction of power relations in a society, media representations. But I am not agreeing with you that there is one concrete construction in society among individuals. I believe in interpretations as well. I think there is a dialectical relationship between these power structures we have and also sort of individuals. I mean, the constructions are much more diverse than I think you present here. Thank you.
So you mean the constructions in the news?
I think individual constructions of news are much more diverse than
the way people read the news.
The way you draw it here.
But what we are finding, we were trying to find, as I said, where news fitted in the life of these people. But where news fit in the life of every single person is different. And in fact, we have in fact already written our results. They're not published yet, but they are under review in journals. And we also talk about intersectionality. And intersectionality is very important because where the news fit depends on all these different positions that each individual have, whether you're a woman, where you come from as an immigrant, whether you are white, whether you're not white, what is your religion, and so on. But I agree with you. It's very complex and it's very multifaceted. Thank you.
Patty?
Yeah, there was just going back to the pandemic, there was one newspaper front page I remember when they were talking about the increase in infection. And the image they put there was of, I think, women from, let's just say they were brown-skinned women and some of them had headscarves. Now, the article referred to the increase in infection amongst immigrants, but the immigrant group that was actually pointed out were from Eastern Europe. So this is an extremely skewed message. But anyway, back to our question about, I think loneliness is maybe the wrong word. I think maybe more social isolation. Isolation is different from loneliness. Like you say, you can be a narcissist and choose to be alone, right? But forced social isolation I think has a different quality. And I referred to Sumaya Ali because when I read that text, it reminded me of a study where they took a group of people. I think these were African American women. At one point, they took biobanks. They could look at their chromosome, the length of their telomeres, right? And then they took, after a number of years, they took another set of blood tests from the same women, and then they could measure the difference in the telomere. So you could say whatever happened from here to there has influenced the telomere. And one of the variables they looked at was the experience of racism. And on top, wasn't just the experience of racism, but it was those that had the greatest change in their telomere length were women, or it was particularly women, were women. It was correlated with educational level, and it also correlated with whether or not the woman had been able to talk about her experience. So if she had not been in an environment where she was able to talk about the discrimination she felt, that was associated, it's not necessarily a cause, but it had a strong association with the greatest reduction in telomere, which is related to, in a sense, your body being hit, getting more easily sick, or yeah. So that was the study I was related, and I think maybe isolation, social isolation, particularly maybe forced social isolation, which I think is maybe also a feature of being, for example, a migrant, because then you've broken away from maybe your family or your community where you're normally supported, and yeah, the support is more tenuous and you are more on your own. Yeah, there was this question in the beginning about how can you get these thoughts in the back of your mind, and I'm not going to take credit for this because I was speaking to a younger person, because I always ask young people when I get these sort of difficult questions, and she said, well, because she works as a counselor therapist, and she said that because we don't know each other, I don't know any of these people in the room except for my wife, and even she, I don't know it totally, which is good, but if you, in meeting somebody initially, you get this kind of yeah feeling, or feel a very strong positive or negative feeling. She said that's when you should check in with yourself and say, what's that about? Because you don't know this person. You are filling in the blanks with stuff that you've got from your experience. You're filling in the blanks on this person that you don't know. And so so just being curious about your own reactions, bodily reactions in meeting with people is one way, and also being open, like me as a doctor, asking open questions. You make assumptions about patients, about how they'll respond to a particular question and how they live their lives, and then you ask them open question, they tell you something completely different, and you see a totally different person in front of you. So that's... Thank you. Yeah.
It's 8:02. So if there are no more questions, we can say that we are done for today, and thank you all for accepting to be a participant in this panel discussion. Thank you, and thanks for coming.